Hi everyone, my name is Mark Levy. I'm the head of our English programs team. Thank you for joining us today for this evening's webinar. As always, we'd love to be doing this face-to-face, of course, so we could see you all, but I suppose that would also mean that some of you couldn't make it. So I suppose that's an advantage of being online at least. Another, of course, is that I'm sitting here at home in Alpedrete. I'm about 50 kilometers northwest of Madrid. We've also got Louise at home in Zaragoza. You want to wave, Louise? You're there. And we've got Richard at the British Council School in Somosaguas. And behind the scenes, we've got Maureen and Carolina, who are both in Madrid. I'll introduce you to Louise and Richard in a moment, a little bit more. But first, just to hope that everybody is safe and well. So, welcome to the first of two webinars for primary school teachers, which form part of our activities celebrating the 25th anniversary of the bilingual program, the Ministerio de Educación y Formación Profesional Council Bilingual Education Program, and it's also the 80th anniversary of the British Council School in Madrid, and therefore the British Council in Spain. As you may know, we were planning to run a big international conference on bilingual and plurilingual education at the end of this month, but then COVID came and COVID stayed, and we had to change our plans. So we'll still be doing something on February the 26th, and I'll tell you a bit more about that at the end of this webinar. But in the meantime, we set up a series of webinars to offer something else to teachers, and especially to those teachers in our bilingual program. So this is the first of the two primary webinars, and they follow the two previous webinars for early years, which I think some of you may well have been at as well, and there'll be two more for secondary in March. The webinars, it's worth mentioning at the beginning, the webinars are intended and planned as two-parters. So they make sense, although they make sense as standalone sessions, they are planned together, they're linked, and they form a whole. This is especially important if you're in the BET project, so if you're one of our bilingual education program teachers, as in next week's session, we'll be looking in more detail at some of the things that you'll see today. The focus of the sessions is on the work that we've been doing in our bilingual education program primary working group, looking at how we can best support teachers who teach literacy, which is at the very heart of our bilingual program. This has involved comparing the integrated curriculum and the UK curriculum. Then we've been looking at our objectives and how best to achieve them, while also making sure that we're aligned with and we take the best from relevant approaches and methodologies from the UK. So we're focused on our program, our Ministerio de Educación Formación Profesional British Council program, but we're also sure that what we're going to cover will be relevant to primary teachers and all other bilingual and plurilingual programs, and hopefully beyond that too. The working group that has put this together, the primary working group, is made up of experienced teachers from schools in the program and equally experienced colleagues from our own British Council School in Madrid. We started off face-to-face, pre-COVID, so looked at the most geographically close regions for our contributors and collaborators, and working with the comunidades, we invited two teachers from each from Aragon, Castilla y León, Castilla-La Mancha, and Madrid, and two of the team are with us today. Louise Van Laar teaches at the Valdesparta School in Zaragoza and has been involved in the project since 2006 at both early years and at primary. She'll be leading next week's session, but she's also joining us for the Q&A today. So that's Louise. You've already said hi, but you want to say hi again? Okay, and the other member of the working group who's here with us today is Richard Stenhouse. Richard is a member of the leadership team in primary at our British Council School and has special responsibility in that role for literacy and for raising standards. And I'll be handing over to Richard in a second. Before I do that, just to say though, that we will leave time for questions at the end. So please do write any relevant questions in the box that's you can see on your screen that's for that, as they occur to you and at the end, and they'll be passed on to me by Maureen to ask Richard and Louise at the end. Given that we'll only have about 15 minutes for questions, please keep them relevant to the content of this session. That's the only thing. So that's it for me for now. I'll pass you on to Richard, and he's going to take us through literacy in bilingual schools, an effective text-based approach. Thanks, Richard.
Okay, thanks, Mark. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for taking the time out of your busy day to come and join us to find out what we've been doing to update the curriculum that you've been using in many of the bilingual schools around Spain, and to bring it kind of up to date to what is happening in our school here in Madrid and in British schools generally. Okay, so in this session, we'll have a look at the audit recommendations. We'll have a brief discussion about the recommended approach and how it's a bit different from what happened before. And then a little bit of discussion about the approach, which is called Talk for Writing, which is a process-focused approach to ensure that children are writing better. Okay, so let's get into it. About 2 years ago, myself and another colleague here at the British Council, Becky Willis, were asked to have a look at and audit the existing curriculum for the integrated curriculum in the bilingual schools. It was a very thick document. We weren't quite expecting such a thick document. And one of the things that we noticed from the outset was that the approach that was there was a little bit outdated. Also, we noticed that it was very much a document filled with what you might call objectives, and that those objectives were very much based around text types, which is how the national curriculum in Britain was organised before, around about text types and looking at the different aspects of that text type from sentence, word and text level. That's changed now. And what we have now is a more comprehensive, broad curriculum, which is a lot more open-ended and easier for teachers to use, a more focused approach to teaching children how to write well, as opposed to incidental pieces of writing or activity-based writing, which could be seen as fillers. So one of the things that we noticed about those objectives within the previous existing curriculum was that it was very much activity-based. There were activities based around text types, for instance, persuasive writing, and then a whole plethora of objectives, which, you know, we felt would probably get people lost rather than help them to get to a piece of writing at the end, which was cohesive. So one of the things that we made sure that we did was to, when we had a look at that, to look at the curriculum as it is now in the UK, and to try and reshape what was already there in a new format and a new kind of structure, and to move away from just covering text types to a more process and outcome approach. The new curriculum in Britain and in England, really, for English, doesn't actually specify which types of text children should have experience of. It's much broader. It says that children should have a broad experience of different text types, but it doesn't actually name which ones they are. Now, you might think that actually makes things more difficult, but actually it makes things much more easy. If you're thinking about the type of approach that you have, and you take a whole text, which is what the new curriculum suggests that you do, you start with a whole text, it's much easier to be able to specify the outcome at the end than it is previously when you're looking at lots of different text types. So making sure that we moved away from just covering text types, that children have an experience of text types, and looking at the why you're doing what you're doing and basing it around a whole text. So yes, as you'll see later on, there are activities which help to reinforce, whether they're grammar or spelling or talk activities or incidental writing activities, but everything that is done has a purpose and contributes to the end goal. Nothing that is there is just stuffed in to fill time, okay, or kind of wedged in because you're not quite sure where else to put it. Other things which are a bit different is the area which used to be called speaking and listening. Now we call it spoken language. And as you'll see in a few minutes, the objectives for that are transversal all the way from year 1 all the way through to year 6. So the very beginning of the primary stage to the end, those same objectives are used. Now, obviously, you're going to have greater expectations of children who are in year 6 than in year 1. But that speaking and listening, or now called spoken language, has two focuses to it. There's very much a skill-based, where children are learning the skills of being able to speak, being able to listen actively, being able to respond to and have opinions about things that they have read, things that they are talking about. And then there's also the speaking and listening part, which is more about the attitudes, perhaps. Another thing which was really important within the new curriculum is that children, although they are learning in English, in the era curriculum called English, that those skills are transferable to other areas of the curriculum. So when we talk about English, what we're really talking about is literacy. We don't want children just to isolate what they learn in English within the English curriculum, but they're able to use those skills and knowledge and understanding and attitudes in different areas of the curriculum. So one of the things that we have ensured is that we, in our worked examples, which I'll show you later, we have provided opportunities for children to use these skills that they're learning throughout this whole text approach in other areas. Okay, so on to the next page. So the new structure then looks more like this. Okay, writing has two different components to it, and the first component is transcription, which is the actual mechanics of writing, and that's probably more focused towards the early years of primary, but it does continue throughout, because the idea is that children would be able to develop their own writing style, handwriting style, that it should be fluent, that it should be functional, that they can take notes quickly, and it should be legible. So it's more about the skill of writing. The composition part looks at how they will write entire texts. So this is where the text type does come in. But when you look at the objectives for writing, it doesn't mention any text types, which you'll see later on. So it leaves it much more open-ended for the teacher to decide, I want my children to be able to write in this style, in this type of way, and all the activities that I'm going to put in there are going to help my children and my students to be able to be independent at the end of this piece of work, to write their own and invent their own piece of work. Reading has, again, different aspects of it. So it comes from the word reading, using a good phonics scheme, being able to decode and encode words, which has that link to spelling as well, and increasing their vocabulary. Comprehension, obviously understanding and being able to discuss at different levels, from simple retrieval to inference and deduction. And that starts at very, very young age. So it's not that we do very simple things of retrieval and then work towards inference and deduction. The deduction and inference start at the very youngest level as well. And it doesn't also always necessarily mean that the child has to be able to access a text themselves and be able to read it on their own. They can listen to the teacher reading, they can listen to peers reading, and be able to respond to that. So there's that oral comprehension as well as the actual reading comprehension independently. Overarching all of that, and something which in the 2014 UK curriculum has a lot of emphasis on, is reading for pleasure. There's no way that you're going to get good writers if you don't have good readers. And good readers are readers who enjoy reading. They read for pleasure. Trying to find texts which engage children, engage their interest more widely, is really important. And with the worked examples which we have created, which I'll show you one later, we've considered very carefully the types of books that we have chosen to make sure that there is that element of enjoying reading just for the pure pleasure of it. That reading is not for just for a purpose of, for school. It's actually that we can enjoy something. The spoken language part I've discussed already, so I'm not going to go into that a bit more. But what is important about that, as you'll see later, is that the spoken part is transversal through everything that the children do. We'll talk about the Talk for Writing strategy a bit later on, but it's hinged upon it's hinged upon being able to speak what I want to write, being able to speak my understanding, rather than missing that important link out from reading for pleasure and discussing to be able to write. There's that talk part which comes in between. Within the 2014 curriculum in the UK, grammar, punctuation, vocabulary and spelling, and that includes phonics, has a much more prestigious place, I would say. Before, it wasn't so explicit. It was more implicit within the text types that you were doing. Now it's really important that children are taught the building blocks of being able to write. And it comes first of all from what they read. So when they're able to identify grammar points within a text, punctuation points within a text, vocabulary that they have learned, spelling patterns or rules which they have learned from the text, it makes it much more relevant for them and they internalize it an awful lot more when it comes to the stage of actually writing. Doing grammar or punctuation or vocabulary or spelling exercises in isolation doesn't actually feed into what children write in the end. Most of the children, as you probably can testify, can go away and they can memorize 10 spelling words and come back and spell them perfectly, and then the very next thing that they do, which you give them where those words are expected to be used, they spell them in 5 different ways. So there's a disconnect between the lesson that you're doing in isolation and the writing that you expect and the application of the grammar and the punctuation, the vocabulary and the spelling and the phonics and so on within their writing. So one of the things that is important within this methodology is that we think about grammar for writing, punctuation for writing, spelling and phonics for writing, and that everything is embedded within what you're doing. So if you're looking at a grammar point, base it around the whole text that you have chosen. If you're looking at punctuation of sentences, base it around real sentences that they have read within the text. Build the vocabulary from the text that you've used. So everything comes around that text. And because you've chosen something which is engaging, which is for pleasure, and you're starting from that point, you're probably going to get much, much better results when they sit down and actually write something. Okay. Now, as I said before, the previous curriculum, when I printed it out, was about this thick, and most of it was just filled with tons and pages of objectives. We have reduced that number hugely, and I'll show you very shortly how that looks. So making sure that each of these different areas, reading, writing, spoken language, grammar, and so on, has its own grammar points, okay? And that those are very broad. Now, what I mean by broad is that I can use the same objectives no matter which text I have chosen. And what I want to do is to look at that broad objective and then tease out other more specific objectives which relate to that overall objective. And you'll see that we've come up with a bit of a code which helps you as a teacher ensure that you are, without any activity that you have chosen to do, that it relates to that broad objective. And that leads us on to success criteria. So buried in amongst that big volume of objectives, there were a lot of things I would have called success criteria. Now, what I mean by success criteria is by the end of what you're wanting to do, what should the children be able to achieve? What can they demonstrate to you? And with our success criteria, you're looking at to what extent they have been successful. So you may have some children within your class when you have planned out your whole text unit of work, and you have made sure that you've hit the nail on the head with all these different objectives, that at the end of it, their success criteria, they're still at an emergent stage. They are not secure. They've been present, they've done the work, and they are beginning to show some understanding, some knowledge, and some skill. Other children will achieve what you expect of them, and yet other children will exceed those expectations. So it's important to have very clear success criteria, and part of that is also allowing your students to become more independent in their own learning. So if the children understand what the objective means and they understand what you're looking for, which is your success criteria, they're much more able to demonstrate what they know you want them to achieve. Okay, and they're able to look at their piece of writing against the success criteria and make a judgment themselves of how well they've done. That also allows them to set targets for themselves, or for you to set targets for themselves. So if you've got your success criteria where you've got emergent, those children who are just beginning to get it, expected, the children who are hitting it for the age range and they know what they're doing and they're demonstrating it, and then you've got those ones who are exceeding that, your children who are expected will want to exceed. So by looking at that exceeding part, I can set targets for that child to be able to go away and say, right, so this is what you've written, and you've ticked all these things here because you've got that right. But let's look at how you can improve it. And the teacher's job becomes that of someone who stops correcting work and rather becomes someone who is an enabler for children to go away, for your students to go away and improve what they do themselves. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So one of the things that was also important for us, and even furthermore when we presented the findings of our audit to the working party, was to make sure that there were opportunities, depending on the school, that you could take a twofold approach. Overarching everything is this idea of literacy. So we want children to be literate, not just be able to have certain skills and knowledge and understanding which they keep within their English classes, but things which, skill sets which are transferable across the whole curriculum. Now, this approach you can use in two ways. Some schools may have an approach which is not a project approach, where it's more a subject-based approach. So yes, you've got your English lessons, but rather than thinking of your English lessons, thinking of your literacy lessons. And you might have your text which you've chosen, and you've gone through the different phases, which I'll explain in a minute, to get to your end piece of writing, and that's enough. And your English lessons focus around that whole text, and that's okay, because you're still looking at encouraging children to become literate, as opposed to having disparate skills in different things. On the flip side of that, there are also schools who enjoy a project approach. And we felt it was really important to make sure that there were lots of opportunities whereby children can and teachers can apply the skills they're learning within their literacy topic, or the literacy book, the whole text approach, in different areas of the curriculum. One of the examples that we made up was for the younger children, about primero or segundo, and it was a book called Meerkat Male. And it's all about a little meerkat who decides he doesn't want to live with his very big family, and he goes on a little journey trying to find his own place. And he travels from one place in the savannah to another. So you can do that within that literacy approach, where he's writing postcards home to his family, and he's writing letters, and the end piece of work is to write a letter or a postcard, and it can stop there. But there's also opportunity for a topic-based approach, where you can start looking at geography and looking at the savannah, looking at animals that live there, looking at ecosystems, looking at meerkats and doing reports about meerkats. There's lots of opportunities to be more maybe ambitious, and to make sure that what they're learning in those literacy lessons is relevant in everything else, and brings it all together, so that they're learning how to do a short report in their literacy lesson. And then when you do your geography lesson, where you're looking at, or your science lesson, where you're looking at animals, they know how to structure that report that you're looking for. So within the literacy lesson, it's about looking at the structure of the text, looking at the features of the text, and making sure the children have all those different building blocks. But what the cross-curricular approach gives you is an opportunity for children to be able to apply what they've learned in that other area. Okay, so it's quite a good kind of all-encompassing approach. Okay, so we talked about moving away from a content covering curriculum to moving towards a process-based approach. And I want to talk to you a little bit about that approach that we're talking about just now. The most effective way for your students to engage within their literacy lessons, to be able to get the most out of any reading activity you do, any grammar activity, any talking activity, any punctuation activity, any writing activity, is to take a whole text approach. So whereas before, when you're looking at text types, you might have an extra excerpt of a text, you might have an example of a text or a model of a text. Here, you are looking at an entire text, and everything you do comes from that. This helps children to internalize all the language structures, the grammatical structures, the vocabulary that you are trying to encourage them to learn by talking the text, talking through it. So at every single point in that journey towards the end piece of writing, talk is your foundation. Talking about their feelings about the text, talking about the structure of the text, the patterns of the text, the flow of the text, the characters within the text. Everything that you want to do which has to do with comprehension or writing or grammar starts with talk. There are also opportunities within this for close reading. Okay, so looking at specific things whereby you can build up vocabulary, you can build up comprehension strategies, you can build up grammar structure and punctuation structure knowledge as well. What's really important is that when you begin, your students are going to be very, very dependent on you to be the model for the writing, for the reading, for the discussion. And as they work through the cycle, or the Talk for Writing cycle, they become much more independent. And your end goal is that they're able to apply all the different things that you've taught them and they've had experience of over the different weeks, to be able to sit down and invent something themselves using all of those skills. So the Talk for Writing approach, and it's just one approach, it's not, by any means the only approach, but it's a very sound pedagogy, and it takes a very much a phased approach, starting off always with reading a whole text and talking about it, understanding it, feeling it, internalizing the text. The children then, with the teacher, move on to story mapping, which is basically a kind of idea where you make a diagram, okay, of the story. So the story that I mentioned to you before is called Meerkat Meal, and it's one of these stories where the main character goes on a journey, okay, and at the end of the journey ends up where they began. So when you're reading a story like that, if you're not able to visualize it and you're just reading it, the children won't kind of get the idea that the character has started in a place, gone to different places, experienced different things, and returned back to where they began again. So when you draw that story map, this kind of story would be a loop. And at different points in the story, the children would draw little pictures to depict what is happening. They would perhaps write on keywords. Quite often, it's really useful for children to use, your fronted adverbials, your adverbs. First, he did this, then, next. And Talk for Writing also has lots of little actions which help it to become much more multi-sensory a type approach. So as the children are talking through it, they know the actions that each of these words has. Then they go on to the next stage, which is imitation, then innovation, and finally invention. So let me look at this. So when we looked at the objectives, what I said to you was that we reduced the objectives and made sure that each of the different components of that, before the reading, the writing, and so on, had objectives which were directly related to it. They are very broad. You can use them in any circumstance. So these same objectives are used in all of the texts that we have chosen for the worked examples. In order to help the teacher, we also discussed coding them. So these ones here on reading comprehension, there are several comprehension objectives, okay? You can see from the very first one, it is enjoying and extending reading types, so having as much opportunity to read different types of text as possible, but at the base of it is enjoying. And as you look across, going towards sexto, you'll see that the variety of text types increases. But at the center of it all is engaging children in the act of reading. Okay? As I said before, the grammar, vocabulary, grammar and punctuation part wasn't really there before explicitly within the previous curriculum. It was very much kind of implicit, and there were other documents apart from that, but now it is an integral part of the new 2014, not so new anymore, but new 2014 curriculum. And as you can see, going across again, those are the same objectives which are used. And what we've done is just try to expand the objective with qualifiers, okay, and give examples where necessary of the depth of knowledge that the children should have. Word reading is very important as well, and you can see that word reading using phonics and different spelling strategies again goes right across. It starts from quite simple things where children are practically decoding and beginning to encode their words, to building the vocabulary, more complex ways of understanding things like using etymology and understanding the roots of words, where they come from, so that they're able to understand how that word is put together. And that's especially important when you're looking at things like prefixes and suffixes. If children understand where the root word comes from and what the prefix and the suffix means, they can understand the meaning of the whole word, and they're able to construct and use much better vocabulary. So here's the Talk for Writing approach. And this is not mine. This is something that has been developed by a man called Pi Corbett. And on his website, you can see little videos to help you to understand how each of these different phases works. So it has really three main parts called the 3 I's. The first part is imitation, where what we're doing is imitating the text that we have read. And usually the first type of writing that the children will do is to create the story map and then be able to talk the story map through. So it's not about rehearsing and telling kind of like a parrot every single word in the story. The children are using their own words to tell the story, but they have a structure in which to follow. So it's much easier for them to see the flow of the story from beginning to middle and end, to see where the problems happen and how they're resolved, how the characters develop as they go through, and they imitate. And the first piece of writing might be just to go away and then write what they have talked, what they've spoken. Going on to the next part is innovation. So it looks at how do we take what we know about this story and what kind of things can we change. So for instance, to use the example again of Meerkat Male, the easiest thing is either to change the place where it happens, or to change the animal who is the character, okay, or the time. So the children might choose to swap the meerkat for a different animal, a giraffe, something like that, or a chimpanzee or something. Or they may choose to take it from a savanna and put it in a jungle, okay, or in the sea. So what they're doing is they're keeping the same structure, they're keeping the same character type, they're keeping the same grammar structures and patterns, and they are making something which is a little bit newer, okay? But they still have that crutch to lean upon, which they can go back and look at again, which is their story map. The first thing that they do is to change that story map. So they're able to talk through the original story, they're able to write the original story. Now they've got to look at the story map again and change those different things. And it's quite often sensible just to change one thing, so change the character. Keep the place the same and change the character. Or change the place, you might have to change the character there, but you're changing the place and what that looks like. So you're changing limited things so that when they draw their map, it's something that's very familiar to them. And again, the first thing they do before they put pen to paper to write their story is to talk it through. Into that, you've got lots of opportunities to look at grammar structures, look at punctuation structures, look at paragraphing, look at things like conversation and dialogue within text. And it's always better to start with something which is familiar to them, and that's to go back to the original text and to look at opportunities where you can look at, if you want to do dialogue, which parts of the original text are the characters speaking and how do we set that out? Let's look at our new text. What are your characters going to say? How are they going to say it? And then start doing it like that, rather than doing an activity with lots of different worksheets on direct speech, yeah? Or looking at how to use commas or how to use paragraphs. where you've got an isolated, independent lesson which doesn't seem to have any relevance to what they're doing. Embed it within the text that you've chosen and give them a real experience of a real text in real time. The last part is invention. So they create a similar story with new characters, new problems, new resolution. And what they've produced at the end is something which is original, it's theirs. But they have all the structures, they have all the support that they need. They have a writing process in which they can grab onto. And it doesn't matter what type of text type you want your outcome to be, whether it's to write a letter or to write a story or to write a report or something non-fiction, you're using exactly the same structure. Within that imitation and innovation part, the role of the teacher is very, very important. And it's the role of the teacher to model that writing. So it's not just a case of the teacher writing something up and the children copying it. It's the teacher writing something up and the children trying to improve it. Okay. So you are deliberately trying to put in errors or put in punctuation errors or miss a word out or something. So you're trying to help them gain the technical skills that they need for the actual function of writing in a context, supporting them with their own writing, okay, all the way along. Okay. So one of the things that we thought was really important was to provide a couple of worked examples for each age range throughout primary. So we've completed a number of fiction texts based around whole texts, and at the moment we're working on some non-fiction texts, again based around whole texts. Here is an example for a book which is called Man in the Moon. Okay, it's a little fiction book. It's a picture book. Okay, and another thing which is really important is not to feel that because you're teaching older children at the upper end of primary that you can't use a picture book. Picture books can be incredibly powerful. They can open up conversations about issues and texts, which may not always open up if you're just using a novel type thing. There are some wonderful picture books which are explicitly intended for older children. They're often called postmodern texts. Okay, so let's go back to this one. This one's a book for younger children, and it's a picture book. And you can see that we have the objectives here. So split into writing, reading, and spoken language, and then each one into its own component. And as you look down, you can see the minimal objectives. Now, all of these objectives are reference with what comes next. But these same objectives I can use in any book. And as we go through the different year groups, they become a little bit more complicated simply by adding some qualifiers. Okay, so we want more independence, we want more depth, we want more risk, okay, and less dependency on the teacher. Okay, let me look to the next one. Here, within this topic of work, which probably takes about 4 weeks, the objective at the end, the writing outcome at the end, is to write a simple recount. And in this case, it's a postcard, okay? A postcard from the man in the moon, little astronaut who goes to the moon, and he sends a postcard home about what he's experienced and what he's doing. Okay, so it's within a context. You're doing a text type, you're looking at all the features, and you're looking at what the success criteria are. Below that, you can see what those success criteria are, and you can see the 3 areas which I talked about before, working towards expectation, where you have emergent children who haven't quite got there yet, but you can see that there is certain progress being made. Working at the expectation are the children who are working at the age level, the age-related expectation for their year group, and then those who are exceeding it. And as you look across, if you read the different ones, you can see that it gets a bit more complicated each time. So the good thing about this kind of thing is that it helps your students, it helps you first of all, but it helps your students to know, if I'm working at expectation and my teacher says this is where I'm at, and I can use a greeting to say hello to a person I'm writing to, how can I make it better? Well, I know that I've got to use alternative. Rather than saying hello, I'm going to use hi. I'm going to say, how's it going? and look for different ways in which you can make the text better, okay? So another, as I said before, another thing which was really important was to provide cross-curricular activities, cross-curricular experiences, better said, where children can link together what they're learning in literacy in other areas and create a more topic-based approach. So within this one, you can see within science, they're going to talk about the moon, they're going to talk about gravity, space outfits and rockets and things like that, looking at history and looking at the moon landing and so on. So it becomes a whole topic, which is everything is related together and everything is relevant, and always going back to that original text. Now, the good thing about it is that you can bring in non-fiction texts which support your writing, okay, and the children's knowledge of the original fiction text. So it gives you that two kind of fold approach. You can just do the literacy part of it, or you can do it as a topic. So the next part, you can see that a kind of cycle approach here. So this first one here is introducing the text, where you're going to do lots of activities where you're reading, you're doing lots of talking activities, you're making predictions about what's going to happen, you're introducing characters, you're discussing what the children already know about the context of the moon and so on. And you'll notice in brackets afterwards that we've referred to the specific objectives which this activity covers, okay? So there's nothing here which has just been shooed in just to cover something. Everything that is done for a purpose, and it's relevant to what comes next. The next part is that imitating. So usually within this part, you're trying to get the children to really engage with the text, to understand the characters, and to role play activities. And all of these kind of things were in the previous curriculum. So it's just basically taking something which was quite disparate and putting it into a package which all makes sense. Again, you can see the references to the different objectives. And as we go through this week, where children are imitating quite often what the teacher is writing and doing some shared writing and shared reading and lots of talking, it takes us into the next week where we start to innovate. So you're looking at something which may be written. You might be starting with something which you have done the previous week as a model, and you're going to try and change some things in it to make it more innovative, make it newer. One of the things, as you can see in that last one, is to give plenty of opportunities for students to be able to peer assess. And when you have those clear success criteria, it's really easy for them to do that. If you don't have something which is clear, the feedback that they're going to give each other is, I liked it, I liked your handwriting, your picture was nice. And it doesn't do anything to help that student improve or move on to the next step. So making sure that clear criteria are shared with the children is really important. Many teachers might have the success criteria at the back of their heads. They know what they're looking for, but it's very powerful to write those success criteria with the children, okay? Now, you might have to do a little bit of leading, but what you're asking them to do is to look at a text and say, what makes this text a good text? What's the structure like? What's the punctuation like? What kind of words are used? How does it engage with the reader? And get them to give you ideas about, this is a good text because it's got these different things. And use that as a basis for their discussions with each other. If they're able to own some of those criteria, you're going to get a fantastic piece of writing at the end. Your students are going to be incredibly engaged in what they're doing, because it's less haphazard of doing an activity here and an activity there, and everything that they do leads to this final piece of writing. The last week would be inventing. So again, as I said, using what they've done before to come up with something completely new, okay? And I'll let you read a few of these different things as I'm talking. One of the things that's really important, if you look at that fourth box along WC2 and WC4, is teaching the children the skill of being able to edit and improve their work. In the previous one, we talked about peer review and peer advice using those success criteria. So here, it's a case of They've done this with a partner, now they have to do it independent themselves. So looking at what they've written and trying to improve that, and always handing in their best piece of work which has been reviewed. As a teacher, I would encourage you to stop being the corrector of children's work and be the facilitator of improvement. So you might find a text which has mistakes and things in it. It's much more powerful to choose one or two things that child can improve upon, and in discussion, create a target for them and send them away to be able to do it as much as possible on their own, so that when they come back with something that is a bit more polished. I know when I was a younger teacher, my idea was that I was correcting their work because I wanted it to be correct. But actually what I found was that the children began to stagnate, and they saw me as the person who would correct and make everything right. Now, we don't want that anymore. What we want are independent writers, independent thinkers who have the skills and the ability to be able to look at something and judge for themselves whether what they've done is their best work. Okay, so Mark, I think I've come to the end of everything that I need to say. Is there anything you want me to add that I've missed out?
No, I think, shall we go for questions? Yeah, Louise, do you want to join us for this?
Shall I stop sharing my page?
Yeah, I think you can for the while. We'll come back to this at the end. Thanks. Okay. Thanks very much, Richard. That was really, I mean, you know, those of us who've been involved in the working group know how much work has gone into that, and that was such a really concise, succinct, and very successful presentation of the work that's been done. I thought that was really interesting. We've got quite a lot of questions coming in of different types. Some are quite specific, some are more general. I think one of them you've sort of covered, but it might be worth just looking at from a slightly different angle. There were two questions which were similar. One, I think you've sort of covered, which was how long should a work on a particular text last? And you've got a 4-week cycle in there. But anyway, you might want to say something about that between you. But the other question, which is similar but from a different angle, is, would it be better to work? Isn't it better to work with more books rather than spend so much time on one? Louise, I don't know if you want to say anything on either of those, and then Richard.
I think it really depends on how the children embrace the text and the activities that you're doing. And quite often you think a story is going to really work, you're very clear about your final piece, everything's working well, and maybe they don't connect as well as you hope they would. Or alternatively, you find a story that they really, really connect with. They're particularly interested in one aspect of that story or the character, and you find that you can go into more depth with that. So for me, it just really depends, but probably not less than 3 weeks. And it also depends, of course, on how many sessions you have in your school, because I know that varies quite a lot. Literacy sessions in each school. In my school, for example, we have between 4 and 5 sessions, but I know in other schools they have less, so you have to adapt it accordingly.
I think that it's always good to have a core text. So, for instance, in this one, it's called Man in the Moon. Is that correct, Louise? Man in the Moon?
Yeah.
Yeah. The one that I talked about, called Meerkat Mail, is one of those stories which is about a journey. So you can have that because your main one, but if you have other texts which have that same type of journey, or stories which have that same kind of journey, you can reinforce that idea of when you're doing your story map, that there's a starting point and he's coming back again to where he started. And along the way, there are certain problems that this character faces. What I wouldn't do is do stories which are, say, for instance, along a theme of space, but have very different structures, because in that case, you're gonna confuse very much. Within what I think Louise did this Man in the Moon one, and one of the things that you can do, because they're doing a non-fiction piece of writing, is introduce other books, non-fiction books about space and about rockets and about whatever, and about Neil Armstrong or whatever, and that widens the experience of the children, which ticks off that first very, very important objective, which is about engaging in reading, just enjoying reading. I don't know about you, but kids tend to get quite obsessed about things. And when you're doing a topic on space or something, they get really obsessed about it, and they go away and they learn new things, and they bring in their books and they show you what they're doing. And as long as it's relevant to that core book, it's fine. But where it's a story that's very different, has to do with space, but it's very different in structure, you want to try and avoid that because you're going to confuse.
Yeah, I think in my experience with that story in Man on the Moon, if you can possibly link with the science teacher, or if you yourself are the science teacher as well, it can be amazing, because they can make a whole big kind of level project about the moon, the solar system, which obviously is part of the contents of the science curriculum, and that becomes really exciting. Yeah,
I agree with Louise. One of the things that is quite big in British education just now, and when we have our inspections, and I'm not quite sure if you know how terrifying our inspections are, we now talk about a deep dive, which sounds quite painful, and it is quite painful. And one of the things that when an inspector comes in and they're talking to the children about their learning, they want to be able to see that the children can create a story of their learning, you know, that it makes sense. So what Louise is saying is that story starts in the literacy lesson with that wonderful little picture book about Man on the Moon, and it continues into the science lesson and into the geography lesson and even into the maths lesson, so that the story of the learning continues and everything is connected and it makes sense.
I mean, in a sense, you've actually answered the next question, which was, but just in case you want to add to it, which is what are the implications of this approach for working with other teachers in the school? I mean, you've answered it really, but is there anything else you want to add to that, or will that do for that?
I think you have to be very coherent, certainly, and when it comes to the planning stage, you know, we've put in suggested ways in which you can link to other areas, that everybody who's involved in that sits together and is on the same page. And as much as possible in the science lesson, if in the English lesson they've done a little bit of non-fiction writing, that the science teacher brings that into the science lesson, so that you're really seeing, and to be honest, what you're doing is really helping your other colleagues, because I don't know about you, but I've had science teachers saying they don't know how to use a ruler. What are you doing in maths? Like I said before, the story has to go through what they're doing. So that means that everyone who's involved in it has to be involved in it and not go away and say, well, I'm doing space, but I'm not doing anything that's relevant to what you're doing. So if you want the experience to be engaging and relevant for everybody, everyone has to be involved in that planning session.
I think it's fair to say as well that it's not absolutely necessary that every story is linked at the same time to science, because otherwise it gets really tricky to coordinate things. But you know, where you can link it, certainly in our school we have a vertical curriculum, so we know more or less what aspects, what topics science teachers are going to cover. We try to coordinate as much as possible. For example, we just did a project on the snowman, and we worked on making because it snowed here in Zaragoza, as I know it did it in most places in Spain, how to make a snowman. So they worked on an information leaflet. That was their final writing product, if you like, of how to make a snowman. Certainly the language that was used in that, using sequences and instructional language, would certainly feed into science, and science language required for them in the science in their science writing.
Absolutely.
I think a lot of this, doesn't it, has to do with, and you mentioned this, Richard, in your presentation, the point of exploiting a text that then becomes familiar and something that they're comfortable with for as much as it can be, while taking into consideration what you said, Louise, that, you know, if they're not interested, you don't want to keep flogging that dead horse, you move on to something else. But I think it's also partly, isn't it, to avoid what can happen, which is just a variety of different activities with different texts and different worksheets, which all seem individually successful at the time, but don't build into anything coherent or anything that actually moves forward.
Yeah,
so it's all part of that, isn't it? Yeah.
Very relevant. I again go back to that same point. It's about the story. Whatever you do, the children have to see a relevance of it.
Yeah.
You know, and it's not to say that you might see we're really struggling with dialogue, and you spend some time doing dialogue, but and you can use some worksheets for reinforcement and things like that. But the most powerful way for you to do it is to go back to your original text and to use that as your what do you call it, springboard into the writing. If you take things which have no relevance that you found on Twinkle or something, and I love Twinkle, then you're going to find that when the children actually come back to the writing again, where the problem was originated, many of them are still going to have the same problem.
Yeah, I agree.
We've got quite a lot, just for actually, this is mainly for the audience. There are quite a lot of questions out there. If we don't get through some of them, especially some of the more specific ones, we can actually pass them on to next week, and we can ask them at the end of Louise's sessions, because a lot of them I think are perfectly applicable to both sessions. You just mentioned writing, and there was a question earlier which I'm trying to find, which was, here it was, what age should children start writing independently, which maybe comes back to your idea of those, working towards expectations, etc. Do you want to mention anything about that? Is there a question about independent writing?
As soon as possible.
Yeah.
Remember that you're working towards an independent writing, and you're giving them the building blocks, the structures, the experience before they start doing that. Yeah. So even children, and it might be that the first story is just a sentence, and that's fine. But what is important is that you give them that, it's like a fledgling and a baby bird. You've got to push them out the nest. Otherwise, they're going to be hanging on to you all the way through. Okay, but you've given them that model, and now you've got to see if they can do it on their own.
I think when you look at the early years and perhaps year 1, year 2, it's great to choose stories that have repetitive language, that have patterns,
absolutely,
that kids can anticipate, and they learn it very quickly as well. And that way, it provides a really straightforward structure for them to imitate that. And even if they're just changing 1 or 2 words for example, the story "My cat likes to hide in boxes," just changing maybe 1 or 2 words that rhyme. That's very achievable for most kids if they're really familiar and they've internalized the story. They can do that from a very young age.
Yeah, the repetition aspect of it is really, really important, because the whole crux of this approach is internalizing a text. So like Louise said, those stories, and there's tons of them there, which repeat and repeat and repeat. Like, we're going on a bear hunt. Not much of it changes. I mean, Michael Rosen has made an absolute fortune with it, and not much of it changes. But it's something that children can hang on to, and then you can innovate. It wasn't a bear; it was a lion hunt. And as Louise said, it's small changes which just help kids. First of all, having that foundation, and then let them write. And many of them are desperate to show their ideas. So let them do it. It doesn't have to be perfect, but it's a starting point.
I must say, I don't begrudge Michael Rosen any money that he's made from that, because it kept my kids busy for a long, long time. Money well spent, well earned, I think. There's a question that's sort of, a different aspect, but similar, which is about how we deal with pronunciation. And again, this idea of when you let them go. The question says, when they read on their own, they might come up with their own pronunciation. So, how are you dealing with pronunciation?
Well, it's very important to have a good phonics scheme, and that's where it has to start. So there's lots of phonics schemes out there. The free one is the letters and sounds from the UK government. Here at school, we use Read Write Inc, and they all are based on a type of approach called simultaneous oral spelling. So it's about knowing how many sounds the word has, and then when we write it, how many letters are needed for each of those sounds, and giving the children lots of opportunities to be able to apply that phonological knowledge and expand that phonological knowledge. Now, I'm Scottish, okay? So when I'm teaching phonics, quite often I have to change my accent, because it's very south of England. And a lot of those vowel sounds are not vowel sounds for me. And you know what? That's okay. It doesn't matter, because what you're doing is not just a sound. You're linking it with a visual, you're linking it with a rhyme, you're linking it with an action, and you're showing children a really foolproof way of being able to read, to decode, and then encode in their own writing.
Yeah, absolutely. The phonics aspect, I mean, in our school, we start as soon as possible. The pronunciation of sounds is really important. We have little kids in Infantile going boat. You know, they say things really well because they're used to sounding them out. So yeah, I really encourage what Richard said, which is, you know, to have a really, really solid phonics program in the school. Yeah.
Yeah. I think part of that, again, and we talked about this in early years last time, and I'm sure we'll talk about it again next week with Louise, is the idea of looking at phonics very often in small. It's not a question of a phonics lesson here and a phonics lesson there. It's constant, it's small, and it's appropriate to whatever else they're doing, and finding those opportunities to practice something that needs to be practiced or use something that needs to be used. Yeah.
And again, you know, I mean, you may have your phonics introduction where you're showing them the sound, and it's my turn, it's your turn, and then go back to the text again, and you will find words which use those phonemes. Get the children to recognise them, get them to identify them, and build up, you know, whatever your phoneme is for the week or whatever, build up a display of those words which come from our text. You know, and you can throw other words in there, of course you can, but it's always more relevant and engaging when kids can recognise things in a text which is really familiar to them.
I'm aware we're running over time. I mean, if you're prepared to, and this is really directed to the audience and you can't answer me, but we will keep going for another few minutes because there are questions, and if you can stay, that's great. I mean, I think we've actually come to the end of the hour, but there are so many questions here and there are things that people want to ask, so we'll keep going, and if you can stay with us, great, and if not, we'll cover some things next week as well. There were quite a few questions about actually choosing stories. There are some which I've lost them in the chain, but I've got some here as well which said, do you have any recommendations for how we should choose a story? What are some of your favourite books? You know, anything on there?
Louise?
I'm such a children's fan. I really am. I think for me, you've got to choose a story that you personally like, perhaps with a character that's relatable, that you can see the kids are going to relate to. Usually it has some kind of message or theme that you can connect with. The story that Richard was mentioning, Mere Cat Mail, is about kind of having to go away from your family and come back to your family, and you know, those kind of feelings, emotional feelings that different characters have in stories. Also what Richard said about picture books being so powerful, illustrations. I work a lot with kids on discussions about the illustrations, about how the characters are feeling, about how the illustrations are actually transmitting emotion. I think that's really, really important. So yeah, it's finding a story that you like, that has relatable characters, perhaps some message or theme, and also that gives you, usually I need to have sort of an idea that comes into my head. So, oh, I can do a postcard with that. That would be great. And then the contents come later. I mean, what Richard said in his discussion about the objectives is true. Those objectives can work for any story. It's just a matter of choosing the activity, the end task, and thinking about how you can, along the journey toward the end task, how you can work on those objectives.
One of the things about the objectives is that it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to cover every single objective within that book, because that takes you back to shoehorning things in, and that you run the risk then of creating a journey which can be perhaps a little bit contrived. So it's good, like Louise said, you know, get something which engages you, and then choose the objective which are relevant for you. And it's always, I always believe it's better to do less and do it well than to try and do too much and not do it well. Because what you'll be tempted to do is to invent things which just cover an objective. And then it takes you back to that coverage and activity-based approach. So you'll see through the worked examples that there are some books where certain objectives aren't covered, but that's okay, because when you do another book, there's probably a high likelihood that you're going to cover that one there. So it's choosing wisely, choosing your objectives wisely, and getting something at the end which is really good quality. So do less, do it well.
Yeah, I think less is more is
yeah, absolutely,
which is relevant for most teaching scenarios, I think, from what my experience. And that's very, very useful. I think it's maybe a good place for us to, especially for those of you who are still with us who are in the bilingual education program, to clarify, you know, that this is much more about our approach to literacy than it is about trying to rewrite a curriculum. So what we've done is we've identified the objectives which are relevant to the UK curriculum, that fit in with the Spanish curriculum, and obviously that will need to be with the LOMLOE. That will end up being checked again, of course, by the Ministry of Education, and to make sure it's relevant. But they're objectives which are almost certainly going to be valid in any sort of curriculum that looks at literacy and English, because they are the objectives for creating independent readers, independent writers, etc., etc. So it's about an approach, and you know, all of the materials that we're putting together, that our experts are providing for us, all the things that we'll publish in the toolkit, all of the things that we'll do in training afterwards, are based on embedding that approach or re-embedding that approach where necessary. And you know, the idea that these are models that you can use, these are examples of the approach, and these are, you know, recommended ways of teaching literacy because of they're successful, and especially helpful, as I say, when I think in many cases when people are maybe perhaps unsure of the objectives. Why am I doing this? It seems to work well in the classroom, but where's it taking us and what's it for? And as Richard said before, and as Louisa said earlier, it's choosing those objectives, it's applying them, and creating activities around them that mean that you know why you're doing what you're doing. And at any point, anybody says to you, why are they doing that? And you can actually say, I know exactly why they're doing that. Exactly. I know where it comes from, and I know where it's going. I know exactly why that is in the classroom. And you know, sometimes that's just because they just needed a break. That's fine too. But whatever it is, it has a purpose. Not just, well, actually, you know, it's a great worksheet somebody gave me. You know, and we've all been there. I mean, there's a time and a place for that too, but that can't be the basis of what we're doing on a regular day-to-day school. There are more questions, but I think maybe we'll go back, because I think we've kept people for a long time. So can we go back to the slides? Well, and what I promise you, those of you who are still with us, that we will cover the other questions next week with Louise's session. So really all I want to do now is to finish off, is just to say thank you. I mean, obviously thank you to Richard and to Louise for the presentation and the questions. Here you can see these are the people who've done the work. There were a couple of others who came in at the beginning, but as you can see, we've had a majority of people from the bilingual program itself, and then our colleagues from the British Council School who've been there as well, and are still there. The working group's still going. We're still doing work. You probably see that on their faces. We haven't let them go yet. There are still things to be done, and we're developing more as we go on. But you know, the whole point of this is that it's useful for the teachers in the program, and beyond the program as well, but especially, as I say, for the teachers within the program. So your feedback on that would be very, very interesting as well, and we'll give you more chances to feedback later on as things develop and as we do more webinars and more work with you. But you know, if you've got something that you want, if you're in the program especially, and you want to tell us how you react to this, we'd be delighted to hear. And then if you go to the next slide, Richard, I know you're still controlling. That's it, yeah. So just so you know, the second session next week, Richard will be here as well. We'll look at, in more detail, at some of the things we've been talking about, a practical tool for literacy in bilingual primary schools. So Louise will take us through a model of a story in more depth. And just so you bear in mind, on the 26th of February, we will have an event that's focused on empowering transformational change, which is focusing on our bilingual program, but also on things beyond that, and how we can help schools, teachers change. We hope to have the Secretary of State for Education with us there, Alejandro Tiana, at the beginning, so that hopefully will be a nice event on the 26th. Again, it will be online because COVID, sadly. So thanks everybody again. Thank you very much, Richard. Thank you very much, Louise. Thank you everybody who was with us for this, and hopefully we'll see you all next week. Stay well, stay safe. Bye everyone.
Thank you. Bye.